On a quiet roadside just outside a small town, a tired Navy veteran and his loyal German shepherd were walking, with nowhere special to go, just trying to get through another day. But then the dog suddenly stopped. He began barking toward something lying near the edge of the road, something the veteran almost walked past. That moment would pull them into a story about a missing son, a worried mother, and a journey none of them expected. Sometimes the smallest decision, like stopping to help someone, can change more lives than we ever imagine. Before we continue, I'm curious. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The small town of Bitterroot Valley, Montana, sat beneath a heavy gray sky that afternoon. Early autumn had already begun to creep across the mountains, and the air carried a cold edge that hinted winter would not be far behind. A steady wind swept through the long grass beside the highway, rattling old wooden fences and sending dry leaves tumbling across the cracked asphalt roads. Bitterroot was the kind of town people drove through more often than they stopped in. There were only a few small businesses along the main street, an aging gas station, a diner with flickering neon lights, and a hardware store that had probably been there since the 1960s. Life moved slowly here, but the quiet also carried a kind of loneliness that felt heavier than the coming winter. Walking along the edge of that road was a man who looked like he had come from somewhere much harsher. Ethan Miller was 34 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, standing just over 6 feet. His posture was straight in the way military training never quite leaves a person. Years in the U.S. Navy had hardened him physically and emotionally, but they had also left behind a kind of quiet exhaustion in his eyes. His face was angular, with a defined jawline and light stubble that had grown over the past few days. His dark brown hair was cut short, but slightly uneven now, no longer maintained to strict military standards. His skin was weathered from years under sun and salt air, and faint lines had begun to form around his eyes, marks left by long deployments and sleepless nights at sea. But what stood out most about Ethan was not his strength. It was the calm, observant way he looked at the world, as if he had learned to read danger long before most people noticed it. Beside him walked the only companion he truly trusted. Max was a 5-year-old German shepherd, large and powerful, with a thick sable coat that blended shades of black and brown. His ears stood alert at all times, and his amber eyes constantly scanned the surroundings with quiet intelligence. Max had once been a military working dog assigned to Ethan's unit during his final deployment. The two had trained together for years. Max had been taught to track scents, detect danger, and respond instantly to Ethan's commands. But beyond training, something deeper had formed between them, something closer to loyalty than discipline. Now that both of them were out of service, they stayed together. Max walked half a step ahead of Ethan, occasionally glancing back to check on him. His tail moved slowly in the wind, and his large paws made soft thuds against the gravel shoulder of the road. Ethan reached down and scratched the dog behind the ear. "Still with me, huh, buddy?" he murmured quietly. Max responded by nudging Ethan's hand with his nose. The truth was that neither of them had anywhere else to go. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had stepped off a long bus ride from Seattle and arrived in Bitterroot Valley with a worn duffel bag and the last of his savings. He had chosen the town simply because it was quiet and cheap enough that he could survive there for a while. The room he rented sat above an old storage garage on the edge of town. It was barely larger than a motel room, with creaky wooden floors and a single window that looked out toward the distant mountains. The landlord, an older man named Carl Dawson, had rented it to him without many questions. Carl Dawson was in his late 60s, a stocky man with gray hair, a thick mustache, and hands permanently stained with motor oil from decades of running the garage downstairs. He spoke bluntly, but not unkindly, the way people in small towns often did. The first time Carl met Ethan, he had studied him carefully before nodding toward Max. "You Navy?" Carl had asked, noticing the faded insignia patch still sewn onto Ethan's jacket. Ethan simply nodded. Carl scratched his chin thoughtfully and said, "Room's cheap. Dog can stay. Just keep him from chasing my chickens." That was the closest thing to kindness Ethan had received since coming back home. But cheap rent did not solve everything. Finding work was harder than Ethan expected. Every morning he walked through town asking about jobs, construction, farm labor, anything. But the answers were always the same. Sorry, we're not hiring. Maybe next season. Try the next town over. Each rejection chipped away at the quiet determination he tried to hold on to. By the end of the third week, Ethan's savings had dropped dangerously low. Still, he refused to give up, and Max refused to leave his side. On this particular afternoon, the cold wind had picked up as Ethan walked along a rural road outside town. The clouds above were thick and dark, threatening rain. Max suddenly slowed his pace. Then he stopped completely. His ears rose straight up. Ethan noticed immediately. Max never reacted without reason. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly. The dog's nose lifted into the wind as he sniffed the air. Then Max turned sharply toward the roadside ditch and barked. It wasn't an aggressive bark. It was urgent. Ethan followed his gaze. About 20 yards ahead, near a patch of tall grass beside the road, someone was sitting on the ground. At first, Ethan thought it might be a traveler resting, but something about the posture looked wrong. The figure leaned forward awkwardly, one arm resting against a wooden fence post. Max barked again and began trotting toward the person. "Max, easy," Ethan called as he followed quickly behind. As they approached, Ethan realized the person was an elderly woman. She looked to be in her early 70s. Her silver hair was tied loosely behind her head, though strands had fallen free and whipped in the wind. Her frame was small and thin, almost fragile, and she wore a long brown coat that looked too light for the cold Montana weather. Her face was pale, and her eyes were half closed. She wasn't resting. She was barely conscious. "Ma'am?" Ethan said, kneeling beside her. The woman didn't respond. Max moved closer and gently nudged her hand with his nose. The dog's behavior was careful and soft, very different from the disciplined intensity he showed during training exercises. The woman stirred slightly. Her lips moved faintly. Ethan leaned closer to hear. "Daniel." The name escaped her like a whisper. Then her head slumped again. Ethan immediately recognized the signs: exhaustion, dehydration, possibly hypothermia starting. She had probably been walking for hours. Max looked up at Ethan with alert concern. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had barely enough money left for himself. Taking responsibility for someone else right now was the last thing he needed. But as he looked at the frail woman sitting helplessly beside the road, a memory flashed through his mind. His own mother standing in the doorway years ago when he left for his first deployment. Waiting. Always waiting for him to come home. Ethan rubbed his face tiredly. "Well, Max," he muttered quietly, "looks like we're not done helping people yet." Max wagged his tail once, as if he had already decided. Ethan carefully lifted the woman to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, and barely able to stand. "All right," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The wind continued to sweep across the empty Montana road as Ethan supported the woman and slowly began walking back toward town. Max stayed close beside them, watching everything, protecting both of them. None of them realized yet that this moment beside a quiet roadside would soon change all of their lives. The wind had grown colder by the time Ethan Miller reached the edge of Bitterroot Valley again. The late afternoon sky was now a dull shade of iron gray, and the smell of incoming rain lingered in the air. The quiet rural road stretched empty behind him, while the distant lights of the small town flickered faintly ahead. Ethan walked slowly, supporting the elderly woman whose weight leaned heavily against his arm. She was conscious now, but only barely. Her steps were unsteady, and every few seconds she paused, as if the ground beneath her might disappear. Max stayed close to Ethan's other side, his large German Shepherd frame moving carefully, almost protectively, beside the woman. His ears remained upright and alert, his amber eyes shifting constantly between Ethan and the stranger. The dog occasionally glanced up at her face, as if making sure she was still breathing. "Easy, Max," Ethan said quietly. Max's tail moved once, but he stayed attentive. The woman's breathing was shallow. Up close, Ethan could see the deep exhaustion written across her face. She appeared to be around 70 years old. Her name, he would soon learn, was Margaret Wilson. Margaret had the delicate frame of someone who had once been stronger, but had grown fragile with age. She stood barely 5 feet tall, her shoulders narrow and slightly hunched from years of life's quiet burdens. Her silver gray hair, thin and soft, had been tied loosely behind her head, though the wind had already pulled several strands loose around her face. Her skin was pale and lined with gentle wrinkles that spoke of decades lived more in patience than comfort. Her eyes were a faded blue, tired but still carrying a quiet warmth that suggested she had once been a very kind woman. Right now, however, they were clouded with confusion and fatigue. They reached the small gravel parking lot outside Carl Dawson's garage just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Carl was standing beside a pickup truck with its hood open, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. The older mechanic looked up as Ethan approached, his thick gray eyebrows pulled together immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," Carl muttered. He walked toward them, boots crunching across the gravel. "Ethan, what in the world happened here?" Ethan carefully guided Margaret toward a wooden bench near the garage wall. "Found her out by County Road 12, Ethan explained calmly. "Collapsed near the fence line." Carl studied the woman carefully. Up close, Carl Dawson looked even older than his 68 years suggested. His broad face was lined from decades of outdoor work, and his thick gray mustache twitched slightly when he frowned. Despite his rough exterior, there was a steady kindness in his dark eyes. "Ma'am," Carl said gently, "you all right?" Margaret looked up slowly. Her voice trembled when she spoke. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Ethan said quietly. Max stepped closer and gently placed his head near Margaret's knee. The dog's presence seemed to calm her. She slowly reached down and rested a thin hand on Max's head. "Oh my," she whispered softly. "What a beautiful dog." Max remained perfectly still, accepting the touch. Ethan crouched down in front of her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "what's your name?" "Margaret," she replied faintly. "Margaret Wilson." Carl nodded thoughtfully. "You got family around here, Margaret?" For a moment, the old woman said nothing. Then her hand trembled slightly as she reached into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. The edges were worn and yellowed, as if it had been carried for a very long time. Ethan took it carefully and unfolded it. Written on the paper was a name and an address. Daniel Wilson. Below it was an address located in Bitterroot Valley. Ethan recognized the street immediately. It was on the far side of town. "I went there," Margaret said softly. "But the house," her voice cracked. "It was empty." Carl rubbed his chin slowly. "That place?" he said. "That house has been abandoned for years." Margaret's shoulders sank. "I walked all day," she whispered. Her eyes began to fill with tears. "I thought maybe someone would know where my son went." The name Daniel echoed quietly in Ethan's mind. He looked down at the fragile woman sitting on the bench. "How long have you been looking for him?" Ethan asked. Margaret hesitated. Then she answered in a voice barely louder than the wind. 8 years. The words seemed to hang in the air. Carl exhaled slowly. 8 years, he repeated. Margaret wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. "He left after a difficult time in his life. I tried writing letters, but they came back. I tried calling, but the number stopped working." Her voice softened even further. "So I decided to come find him myself." Ethan glanced down at the worn paper again. The address was clearly outdated. "You walked all the way from the bus station?" he asked. Margaret nodded weakly. I didn't know where else to go. Max suddenly stood and moved closer again. The dog gently nudged Margaret's hand with his nose. She looked down at him and gave a small, tired smile. He reminds me of the dog my husband used to have, she said softly. His name was Ranger. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. For a moment, he thought about his own mother again. About the night she used to wait for his phone calls when he was deployed somewhere far out in the Pacific. About how she would always say the same thing when he called. Just come home safe. She had passed away 2 years before Ethan returned from his final deployment. He had never gotten the chance to say goodbye. Ethan folded the paper slowly. Carl crossed his arms. Well, the mechanic said, you can't leave her out here tonight. The rain was beginning to fall more steadily now. The temperature was dropping. Margaret looked between the two men with quiet embarrassment. I don't want to be a burden, she said. Ethan shook his head immediately. You're not. He stood and looked toward the staircase that led to his small rented room above the garage. The room was barely large enough for him and Max. His money situation was already dangerously tight. But none of that seemed to matter in this moment. Ethan looked back at Margaret. You can stay in my room tonight, he said calmly. Carl raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Margaret looked stunned. Oh no, I couldn't. You can, Ethan replied gently. Max wagged his tail softly. Margaret's eyes filled again. I don't know how to thank you. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. You can start by getting warm. He offered his hand to help her stand. Max immediately moved to Margaret's other side again, as if already assuming the role of her escort. Together, the three of them slowly walked toward the stairs leading to Ethan's small room above the garage. Outside, the cold Montana rain continued to fall. But for the first time that day, Margaret Wilson was no longer alone. And Ethan Miller had just made a decision that would quietly change the course of all their lives. The rain that had begun the evening before continued through most of the night, tapping steadily against the small window of Ethan Miller's rented room above Carl Dawson's garage. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, damp stillness across Bitterroot Valley. Thin fog clung to the fields beyond town, and the distant mountains were hidden behind pale gray clouds. The air smelled of wet soil and pine trees, and the temperature had dropped enough that frost had begun to form along the edges of the gravel roads. Inside the small room above the garage, the warmth was modest but comforting. The space was simple, barely large enough for a single bed, a worn wooden chair, and a small table pushed against the wall. Ethan's duffel bag rested in the corner, beside a pair of boots still dusted with road dirt. A small electric heater hummed quietly near the window, doing its best to fight the Montana cold. Margaret Wilson sat wrapped in a thick blanket on the chair near the heater. She looked slightly stronger than the night before, though the exhaustion had not completely left her face. Her silver hair had been brushed neatly back, and the color had returned faintly to her cheeks. Across from her, Max lay on the floor with his head resting on his large front paws. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had not moved far from her side all night. At several points, Ethan had woken to see the dog lifting his head whenever Margaret shifted in her sleep, as if standing silent watch. Now Max opened one eye as Margaret adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. You stayed up all night, didn't you? She said softly to the dog. Max's tail thumped gently against the floor. Ethan stood near the small sink in the corner of the room, pouring hot water from an old kettle into 2 chipped mugs. He handed one to Margaret. Careful, he said. Still hot. Margaret accepted the mug with both hands. Thank you, Ethan. Her voice sounded steadier today. They sat in quiet for a moment. Then Margaret's eyes drifted toward the small window. I didn't expect kindness when I came here, she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms folded. Small towns still have some of that left, he replied. Margaret smiled faintly. Max suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then he stood. The dog walked toward the door and sniffed near the bottom edge. What is it, boy? Ethan asked. Max glanced back at him and let out a soft huff. Ethan opened the door. Cold morning air rushed in. Down below, Carl Dawson was already working in the garage. The old mechanic looked up. "You two alive up there?" Carl shouted. Ethan leaned over the railing of the small staircase. "Yeah." Carl wiped grease from his hands and nodded toward Margaret. "How's she doing?" "Better," Ethan replied. Carl gestured toward the diner across the street. "Then get some real food in her. Coffee, too. My treat." Margaret looked surprised. "That's very kind," she said. Carl shrugged. "Town rule," he muttered. "Nobody freezes or starves if we can help it." An hour later, Ethan and Margaret sat inside the small diner across from the garage. The place was warm and smelled strongly of coffee and bacon. Old wooden booths lined the windows, and a radio played faint country music somewhere near the kitchen. A waitress approached their table. Her name tag read Sarah Whitaker. Sarah appeared to be in her early 40s. She was tall and lean, with sun-tanned skin that suggested years of living under Montana skies. Her light brown hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and a few strands had escaped around her face. Her eyes were sharp but friendly, the kind of look someone develops after spending years listening to people's stories across a diner counter. "What can I get you two?" she asked warmly. Her gaze briefly dropped to Max sitting calmly beside Ethan's chair. "That dog yours?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Well, he's better behaved than half the customers we get," she said with a small smile. Margaret chuckled softly. Sarah placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of Margaret and a large mug of coffee beside it. "You look like you needed this," she said gently. Margaret nodded gratefully. As they ate, Ethan quietly asked people around town about the name written on Margaret's old paper. Daniel Wilson. Some people frowned in thought, others shook their heads. But eventually one man sitting at the counter spoke up. "You mean the Wilson boy who used to live on Ridge Street?" he asked. The man's name was Tom Alvarez, a rancher in his mid-50s, with a thick beard and sun-darkened skin. His wide shoulders and calloused hands suggested decades of hard work outdoors. Ethan turned toward him. "That's the one." Tom rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Haven't seen him in years," he said. "Left town after some trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Ethan asked. Tom shrugged. "Lost his job at the lumber mill. Then his wife left him not long after." Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Tom noticed and softened his voice. "Last I heard, he might have gone north. Somewhere near Silver Ridge." "Silver Ridge?" Ethan repeated. Tom nodded. "Small town, maybe 100 miles from here." Ethan glanced at Margaret. Hope flickered in her tired eyes. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to check the road where he had found Margaret. Something had been bothering him since the night before. Max walked ahead along the gravel shoulder, nose close to the ground. The dog suddenly stopped near a patch of tall grass. His tail lifted. Then he stepped forward and began pawing gently at something hidden beneath the weeds. "What did you find?" Ethan asked. Max grabbed a strap in his mouth and pulled. A worn leather handbag emerged from the grass. Ethan immediately recognized it. Margaret's bag. It must have fallen when she collapsed. Inside were a few personal items. A small wallet, an old photograph, and a folded letter. Ethan studied the photograph carefully. It showed a younger Margaret standing beside a tall man in his early 30s. The man had dark hair, a square jaw, and a reserved expression. On the back of the photo was a name written in fading ink. Daniel. Ethan slipped the photograph back into the bag. Max wagged his tail proudly. "Good work, buddy," Ethan said. Back at the room above the garage, Margaret gasped softly when Ethan handed the bag to her. "Oh, I thought it was gone forever." She carefully opened it and held the photograph. Tears filled her eyes. "That's my son," she whispered. Ethan looked out the window toward the distant highway stretching north. Silver Ridge, 100 miles away. Maybe the first real lead they had. Max sat beside him quietly, watching, waiting. Ethan finally spoke. Looks like we might have somewhere to start. The morning Ethan Miller decided to leave Bitterroot Valley. The sky was clear, but bitterly cold. The storm from 2 days earlier had washed the air clean, leaving the mountains sharp and blue against the horizon. Frost coated the fields outside town, and the early sunlight stretched long shadows across the quiet streets. Inside the small room above Carl Dawson's garage, Ethan packed the few belongings he owned into his worn duffel bag. There wasn't much left. A couple of spare shirts, a navy jacket that had seen years of hard weather, a flashlight, and a small folding knife he had carried since deployment. Max sat near the door, watching him with calm attention. The German shepherd seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. His thick sable coat glowed faintly in the pale morning light, and his amber eyes followed Ethan's movements carefully. Margaret Wilson stood near the window, holding the photograph of her son Daniel that had been found in her bag the day before. She looked nervous, not the quiet exhaustion Ethan had seen earlier, but the fragile anxiety of someone afraid hope might disappear again. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said softly. Ethan zipped the duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder. "Yeah," he replied. "I do." Down in the garage, Carl Dawson leaned against the hood of Ethan's old truck. The vehicle was a faded 1998 Ford pickup, its red paint dulled by years of sun and dust. Rust crept along the wheel wells, and the engine had a low, rattling sound when it started. But it still ran. Carl scratched his gray mustache as Ethan walked down the stairs. "You sure that thing's gonna make 100 miles?" the mechanic asked. Ethan shrugged. "It'll try." Carl looked toward Margaret, climbing carefully into the passenger seat. Then he looked back at Ethan. "You're a good man," Carl said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "Just trying to do the right thing." Max jumped into the back seat and settled behind Margaret, his large frame filling most of the space. A few minutes later, the truck rolled slowly out of Bitterroot Valley. The road north stretched long and quiet through open farmland and scattered pine forests. Snow still clung to the distant mountain peaks, though the valleys remained clear. For most of the drive, Margaret held the photograph in her lap. Her hands trembled occasionally, but her eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. Max rested his head between the front seats, watching both of them. Hours later, they stopped at a small roadside gas station just outside a rural junction town. The station looked old and weathered, its wooden siding faded and cracked. A single gas pump stood beside the building, and a hand-painted sign advertised hot coffee inside. As Ethan stepped out of the truck, the cold wind cut sharply across the empty lot. Max jumped down beside him, while Ethan filled the tank with the last of the money he had left. Max wandered a few feet away, sniffing along the gravel. Suddenly the dog stopped. His nose lowered toward the ground. Then he grabbed something in his mouth. "What did you find?" Ethan called. Max trotted back, tail wagging slightly. In his mouth was a brown leather wallet. Ethan frowned and took it. The wallet looked worn but recently dropped. Inside were several cards and a driver's license. Ethan pulled the license out. The name printed across it made him pause. Daniel Wilson. Margaret stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan showed her the license. Margaret's breath caught instantly. "That's him," she whispered. The photograph on the license showed a man in his late 30s with dark hair and tired eyes. His face was thinner than in the older photograph Margaret carried, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Ethan flipped through the rest of the wallet. There were a few folded receipts. One of them had a company name printed across the top. Silver Ridge Timber Company. Ethan looked up toward the forested hills beyond the gas station. Silver Ridge. They were close now. Inside the gas station, a man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with a thin frame and long gray hair pulled back into a short ponytail. His face was narrow, with deep lines around his mouth that suggested he had spent most of his life outdoors. His name tag read, Walter Briggs. Walter looked up as Ethan entered. "Morning," he said calmly. "You lose a wallet?" Ethan asked. Walter glanced at it. "Nope. But I know whose that is." Ethan placed it on the counter. "Daniel Wilson?" Walter nodded. "Yeah. Works over at the timber yard outside town." Margaret's hands trembled again. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle in the quiet room. After nearly a decade of searching, they were suddenly only a few miles away. 30 minutes later, the truck rolled slowly into the yard of Silver Ridge Timber Company. The place was loud with the sounds of machinery and falling lumber. Stacks of freshly cut logs filled the yard, and the smell of pine sap hung thick in the air. Men moved between the equipment, loading trucks and cutting boards. Ethan stepped out of the truck and looked around. A tall man stood near a stack of lumber, speaking with another worker. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized him from the photograph. Daniel Wilson was taller than Ethan expected, nearly 6 feet, with broad shoulders shaped by years of manual labor. His dark hair had grown slightly longer, and a short beard covered his jaw. His face carried the quiet heaviness of someone who had been through too many disappointments. When Ethan approached, Daniel looked up cautiously. "You Daniel Wilson?" Ethan asked. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" Ethan held out the wallet. "Think you dropped this?" Daniel took it slowly. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. "Where'd you find it?" "Gas station down the road." Daniel nodded once. "Thanks." He turned as if ready to leave. Then Ethan spoke again. "Your mother's looking for you." Daniel froze. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he shook his head. "You got the wrong guy." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside. Margaret stood a few feet behind him. Her hands trembled. Her voice barely escaped her lips. "Daniel?" The man's shoulders stiffened instantly. Slowly, he turned around. When he saw her, the color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret took a small step forward. Tears were already falling down her cheeks. "I finally found you." Daniel looked away, shame flooding his expression. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he muttered. Ethan watched quietly. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "I lost everything," he said bitterly. "My job, my family, my house." He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "What kind of son comes back after that?" Ethan stepped closer. His voice was calm. "You think you failed?" Daniel didn't answer. Ethan glanced toward Margaret. She stood there trembling, waiting. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "Maybe you did." Daniel looked up. "But to a mother," Ethan continued, "her son isn't a success or a failure." He nodded toward Margaret. "He's her whole world." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. For a long moment he stood frozen. Then he walked forward and wrapped his arms around his mother. Margaret held him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. Behind them, Max wagged his tail softly, and Ethan stood quietly beside the truck, watching a family finally come back together. The yard of the Silver Ridge Timber Company slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the emotional moment that had unfolded there. Machines roared again, saws cut through heavy pine logs, and workers continued their tasks, though many of them had paused earlier to quietly observe the reunion between Daniel Wilson and his mother. Margaret Wilson still held her son tightly, her frail arms wrapped around his broad shoulders, as if she feared he might disappear again the moment she let go. Daniel stood stiffly at first. For years he had imagined this moment, but always in a different way. One where he had rebuilt his life, where he could face his mother with pride instead of shame. But life had taken him down another path. Daniel Wilson was 39 years old, tall and solidly built from years of physical labor. His dark brown hair had begun to thin slightly at the temples, and a rough beard covered his strong jawline. His face carried the quiet weariness of someone who had spent too long fighting battles alone. There were faint scars across his knuckles from years working heavy machinery and handling lumber. Yet behind the exhaustion in his eyes was something else, a deep, buried kindness that had never completely disappeared. When he finally stepped back from the embrace, his eyes were red. "Mom, you shouldn't have come all this way," he said quietly. Margaret reached up and gently touched his cheek. Her thin fingers trembled slightly. "I would have walked across the whole country if I had to," she replied. Daniel lowered his gaze. "I didn't deserve that." Margaret shook her head slowly. "You're my son." Her voice softened. "That's all that matters." Daniel looked at her again, and something inside him finally broke free. Years of guilt and regret spilled across his expression. "I lost everything," he admitted. "My job at the mill, my marriage, my house." His voice grew quieter. "I thought if you saw me like this, you'd be disappointed." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered. "I'm your mother, not your judge." She placed her hand over his. "You're alive. That's enough for me." A few feet away, Ethan Miller leaned casually against the side of his old truck, giving them space. Max sat beside him, his large ears perked forward as he watched the scene. The German shepherd's tail wagged slowly. He seemed to sense the emotional shift in the air. Daniel eventually turned toward Ethan. For a moment he looked uncertain, as if unsure how to speak to the man who had brought his mother all this way. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Someone had to." Daniel nodded slowly. "Well, thank you." Ethan gave a small smile. "No problem." At that moment, another man approached from the far side of the timber yard. He was older than most of the workers there, likely in his late 50s. His broad frame and thick arms suggested decades of manual work. But there was a relaxed confidence in the way he walked. His weathered face was lined from years in the sun, and his salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed. The man wore a worn denim jacket and a faded ranch hat. "Everything all right here?" he asked. Daniel nodded quickly. "Yeah, Frank, everything's good." The man's name was Frank Dawson. Frank was the owner of a small cattle ranch located just outside the town of Silver Ridge. He had hired Daniel a year earlier, after the younger man arrived looking for work. Frank was known locally as a practical but fair employer. Years earlier, he had lost his own younger brother to alcoholism, an experience that had shaped his belief that people sometimes deserved a second chance if they were willing to work for it. Frank glanced briefly at Margaret, then at Ethan and Max. "That dog yours?" he asked Ethan. "Yeah," Ethan replied. Frank studied Max with interest. The German shepherd sat tall and calm, his thick coat shining in the afternoon light. "Looks like a smart one." Max tilted his head slightly. Daniel spoke up. "He was in the Navy with Ethan." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Military-dog?" "Something like that," Ethan said. Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Well, we could use someone like him out at the ranch." Daniel looked at Ethan. Then he turned back to Frank. "Ethan drove my mom all the way out here from Bitterroot Valley," he explained. Frank let out a low whistle. "That's a long drive." Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "He's been having a rough time finding work." Frank crossed his arms and looked Ethan over carefully. The older rancher had the habit of judging people quietly before making decisions. Finally, he spoke. "You ever worked with cattle?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really." Frank shrugged. "Can you fix fences? Carry feed? Wake up before sunrise?" Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. "I was in the Navy." Frank laughed softly. Fair enough. He nodded toward the hills beyond town. My ranch is about 10 minutes east of here. Small place, nothing fancy. Then he gestured toward Max. That dog could probably help with the herd, too. Max's ears perked immediately. Daniel turned to Ethan. You could stay with us for a while, he said, at least until you figure things out. Ethan looked between Daniel, Margaret, and the open countryside beyond the timber yard. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't look completely uncertain. All right, he said quietly. I'd like that. Months later, summer had arrived in Silver Ridge. The fields surrounding Frank Dawson's ranch stretched wide and green beneath a golden evening sky. Cattle moved slowly across the pasture, while wooden fences traced long lines over the hills. Near the edge of the property, Ethan stood leaning against a fence post. He looked different now. The exhaustion that once shadowed his face had faded. His posture remained strong, but the tension that had followed him since leaving the Navy had finally begun to loosen. Beside him, Max lay comfortably in the grass. The German shepherd had become a favorite at the ranch. With his intelligence and discipline, he quickly learned to help guide cattle during long days in the fields. The ranch hands often joked that Max worked harder than half the men there. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. Not bad for a couple of washed-up Navy boys, he murmured. Max wagged his tail lazily. Across the yard, the small ranch house glowed warmly in the light of the setting sun. On the front porch, Margaret sat in a rocking chair beside Daniel. They were laughing about something Ethan couldn't hear, but the sound carried gently across the quiet pasture. Ethan watched them for a moment. Then he looked out across the open land, stretching toward the distant mountains. For the first time since leaving the Navy, he felt something settle deep inside his chest. Peace. A place to belong. And it had all started on a lonely Montana road. The moment Max stopped and barked beside a fallen stranger. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with bright lights or loud signs. Sometimes they come quietly, on an empty road, on a cold afternoon, through a small moment we almost walk past. That day, Ethan didn't know his life was about to change. He was just a tired man walking with his loyal dog, trying to survive one more difficult day. But when Max stopped beside the road and barked, something greater than coincidence may have been at work. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was destiny. Or maybe it was one of those quiet ways that God moves in our lives. Because one small act of kindness led to something none of them expected. A mother finding her lost son. A broken family being reunited. And a lonely veteran finally finding a place where he belonged. Life often feels uncertain. We struggle, we fail, and sometimes we think we've lost our way. But stories like this remind us that even in the hardest moments, God may already be preparing a path we cannot yet see. Sometimes all it takes is one decision to help someone. One moment of compassion. Or one loyal companion who refuses to walk past someone in need. So if this story touched your heart today, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope. Tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment in your life that felt like a quiet miracle? And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, kindness, and the powerful bond between people and animals, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community so you never miss the next story. Before you go, we want to say a small prayer for everyone watching. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your steps when life feels uncertain. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and kindness to the people you meet along the way. And may you always remember, sometimes the greatest miracles begin with something as simple as stopping to help someone on the side of the road. Thank you for being here.